Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Glad you stuck it out till the end for this. As those of you who know me know, I'm primarily a Russian military and Russian defense industry expert. So this is I'm going to be talking about U.S. and EU assistance to Central Asia. So it's a little bit of a departure for me. A lot of what I'm going to say is based on a report that I did published about a year ago on external support for Central Asian military and security forces. That's publicly available through CIPRI and the Open Society Institute. And, you can find that if you haven't seen it. So I'm going to spend most of the time talking about the U.S. and a little bit about the EU. Let me start talking a little bit about the goals of the U.S. goals in providing assistance to Central Asia. Now, we heard Clark this morning talk about this, and I have, I'm largely in agreement with him, but I have a little bit of my own take, so take that for what it's worth. The key reason that the U.S. government considers Central Asia strategically important is because of its position as the critical transport and trade, to some extent, overland link between Europe and East and South Asia, and primarily as a supply corridor for Afghanistan. That's been maintaining access for the Northern Distribution Network or its predecessors in various ways as far as getting troops and equipment to Afghanistan has been the top goal for the U.S. government, certainly for DoD, but I would argue broader than DoD, for the last decade. And now it's gone down a bit, but that's always been the main goal. Second goal was, which preceded the involvement in Afghanistan, was the region's energy resources as a strategically important alternative to Russian supplies in Europe. And that kind of faded away in part because of the emergence of NDN, but in part because of the emergence of China as an alternative customer. That kind of so the Russian monopoly on transit from Central Asia was eliminated without any EU routes to EU, and in part because the EU got other sources, the shale and all this. So that's declining maybe a bit as an interest, but it's still there. And the security side of that is there's always been a lot of programs with the U.S. government about protecting critical energy infrastructure in the region, helping Central Asian states maintain the security of their offshore oil and natural gas platforms in the Caspian, and that sort of thing. Third goal, securing the borders of the various partner states in Central Asia, and that's critical for several sort of areas. Counterproliferation was the first one, back when everyone was worried about loose nukes and fissile material and that sort of thing. Preventing the transit of terrorists came in, and counter-narcotics. But if you think about it, those are actually all one problem, which is preventing smuggling across borders. It's just a question of what is it? Are you smuggling nuclear materials? Are you swallowing drugs? Are you smuggling people? But it's still all smuggling. In some ways, it's very similar kinds of programs that you need in place to prevent that. And then the fourth and final goal is building state capacity, particularly in internal and external security. And this is done through various kinds of security assistance programs, through regional conflict prevention initiatives, bolstering regional border and customs controls, et cetera, into regional integration of efforts of various kinds. So those are the kinds of programs that are done. Now, the United States, as far as, let me not focus, that's kind of the global picture. As far as actually providing military assistance and security assistance to Central Asia, there's been more and more of a focus on training programs over equipment. And in part that's because the track record in providing equipment to Central Asian states over the years has been quite poor. There were a lot of, in the early years, in the late 90s, early 2000s, there were a lot of equipment donations that were wasted because of inadequate maintenance, lack of training in their use, various kinds of internal disagreements within the countries that got the weapons. And the U.S. government recognized those issues. I'll have some examples when I talk about specific countries, but recognized all those issues and shifted to training. That then brought its own problems. As we heard this morning, there's been a lot of focus on training special forces, in part because that's what the recipient countries have been most interested in. But the problem is that special forces, no matter how much you train them in Western democratic norms and proper behavior and so forth, they can very easily be used to repress civilian populations rather than to counter terrorist attacks, which is what we're training them to do. And the techniques that are used are very similar. So now the US government, if you talk to officials, argues quite vehemently that its training has reduced violence against civilians by these forces. The track record is actually mixed. There's some, there's been some cases where maybe forces that could have gone out and repressed protesters in Kyrgyzstan, for example, stayed in their barracks. At least that's the U.S. government argument. There have been other cases where forces that had previously received U.S. training clearly didn't stay in their barracks. Tajikistan is one key example. There have been some reports, not confirmed, that some of the troops that were used in Zhana Ozen in Kazakhstan had some U.S. training. It's unclear whether they were or not, but in any case, it's out there. So that's a tension that's there for the U.S. Now, one thing that I think is quite clear, that in this period of reduced budgets and limited resources, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, that's getting close to completed now, and is likely to result in a decreased emphasis on all forms of assistance to Central Asia, and particularly just in security systems. No matter what DoD says, and no matter how many protestations there are about long-term programs, I'm sure they'll stay, but it's going to be a much lower priority for the Defense Department than it has been. Now, security assistance budgets for the states in Central Asia have already been cut in recent years. They maybe have been cut so much that there won't be too many more cuts, or they may be cut more. We'll see. Depends on how much money there is and what other priorities there are. And the new confrontation with Russia, I don't think is going to change that very much, because most of the focus now is on Eastern Europe and the Caucasus, and not so much on Central Asia. So as a result of all of these, of that, when the drawdown was happening last year, the year before, Central Asian leaders really sensed that the withdrawal period was kind of the final opportunity to receive significant amounts of military assistance from the U.S. And there were publications about these kind of wish lists that various countries were sending to the U.S. about various kinds of equipment that they wanted that were quite fanciful, given what we know about realities as far as U.S. Equipment donations. And now over time, there was sort of that burst, and then it became clear that the extent of potential U.S. assistance was relatively overstated, both in terms of the amount and the significance of the equipment that's likely to be provided, and the potential impact of such assistance on regional security. So, as far as I know, the Excess Defense Article database, which hasn't, for whatever reason, hasn't been updated since May of 2014, the only authorized transfer of EDA equipment in recent years to Central Asia was trucks for Kazakhstan. Now we know that there's also been some equipment approved for Uzbekistan, MRAPs, and UAVs. That's not yet in the database I mentioned, when they get around to updating it. There may be some other things there as well that I haven't noticed, but in any case, it's fairly minor, and certainly no major weapon systems, not even small arms. And so, trucks and surveillance UAVs are nice, but they're not sort of the kind of thing that's going to change the security environment in the region. Now, the training programs that the U.S. has have really been have had more of an impact. And we talked about English language programs, and those are this morning, and they are for each country, and I think maybe play a role. The question is always the extent to which the people who get that training stay in the military afterwards, as opposed to now that they know English, they can go and get better jobs than being in the military. Let me talk a little bit very quickly about the specific countries, and then even more briefly about the EU. Kazakhstan is, I think, the key relationship, just because it's the most important country in the region as far as security issues, and that's sort of an area where some of the troubled equipment assistance programs really damaged the relationship a few years ago. There was a Huey 2 transfer program that got a lot of negative press and led to distrust among the Kazakhs towards the U.S. There were some other programs that are more successful, Humvees, especially border security and counter-narcotics equipment, and there's a long history of counter-proliferation cooperation with Kazakhstan. It's a relationship that's works at a very high level. There's a lot of bilateral consultations, a lot of joint exercises that are done. So it's something that clearly both sides see as important. Kazakhstan because it wants alternatives to Russia, as was discussed in the previous panel. U.S. because it sees Kazakhstan as the key player in the region, together with Uzbekistan, the other country, which also had extensive assistance until 2005 in exchange for use of a base in Uzbekistan. Then Andijan kind of scuppered things for a few years, and then has been gradually reinstated through various programs, sort of culminating in 2012, and sort of full range of programs pretty much was reinstated. But again, the U.S. pretty much refrains from providing lethal military equipment to Uzbekistan despite requests. But they do get night vision goggles, bulletproof vests, GPS equipment, that sort of thing. And now, most recently, the UAVs and MRAPs that I mentioned. Probably Turkmenistan is the country with the least interaction. It's kind of not, some counter-smuggling equipment, pretty much no military training. There's some border guard interactions, but no real interaction with the military. Kyrgyzstan, everything, until recently, everything was sort of focused on Manas, and Alex was telling me there's stories about the den of corruption that Manas represented, but as part of
that was an actual quote from the memoir of the former Secretary of Defense, from the Gates. His words.
Yes. But there's been a lot of equipment training for the border guard again, and similarly with Tajikistan, border guard is one of the main areas. Now, and then there's also a lot of multilateral training through PFP and various NATO programs that I don't really have time to get into, but it's kind of described in detail in the report. The European Union, very quickly, has been much more focused on sales compared to the U.S. So I was kind of highlighting different things that I found when I did the report. There were, helicopters for Turkmenistan. And we have a lot of well, I guess it's not really EU, but Turkey provides a lot of equipment to Kyrgyzstan, to Turkmenistan. We have Land Rovers from the UK for Uzbekistan. So compared to the US, there are actually like more serious equipment sales that are going on, as well as the Kazakhstan joint cooperation in developing new equipment through joint projects with European industry. There's also through the OSCE, the EU has done a lot in terms of EU states have done a lot in terms of improving local capacity in counter-narcotics and border control. By comparison, there's not that much direct military assistance compared to the U.S. So there's kind of a different focus in the EU. I guess just to conclude, the overall external military assistance to Central Asian states from the U.S. and the EU has been maybe less significant than one might expect overall. There's been training. The training has not had a huge impact, I think, in improving the quality of the military, despite serious efforts to improve all of the things that Clark talked about. And now, with the end of NATO operations in Afghanistan, I think it's only going to decrease. And so the states of the region are going to be left partially to their own devices, but more and more sort of reliant on Russia and maybe China, if Russia doesn't succeed in their efforts to improve their militaries, and we'll see the U.S. and the EU doing less and less in the region.
Great. Thanks a lot, Dmitry. And thanks to all